Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist. And I'm joined today by my co-host,
Jonathan Edens. I'm a psychiatric PA.
All right, so this is episode number 2 in a series on ADHD. And today we're going to be talking about products and techniques to help manage ADHD symptoms. And we have some interesting ways because, in reality, ADHD primarily is treated with medication. And while Jonathan and I are not anti-medication, we also realize there are so many other things that you can do for treating ADHD. And Jonathan, what's the problem if we just focus on medication to manage ADHD versus kind of looking at it in a more holistic way?
Well, the first problem is that it doesn't work for everybody, right? And if you're not giving people multiple solutions to the same thing, then you're not really giving them all of the available solutions for them to split test, right? And as a result, you may be leaving multiple potential therapeutic strategies on the table that they just don't really have the awareness that exist, right? And there are definitely cases where I've had patients be on stimulant medication and patients not be on stimulant medication, but really focus on a lot of these more holistic strategies and have been able to manage their symptoms in a way that is sufficient for their needs.
Now, are there any potential risks to just taking medications as far as side effects, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about stimulants, specifically the ones like Adderall or Ritalin, these definitely have a strong abuse potential. They're classified as a Schedule II medication. For many of you may know, right? Adderall, the generic, is actually amphetamine, levoamphetamine, or mixed amphetamine salts. So these are serious medications. And while those risks often can be mitigated via multiple different strategies, they still have the potential for abuse and dependence. However, we also see a risk of cardiovascular events with these medications, right? They tend to be vasoconstricting, they tend to increase blood pressure and heart rate. And so while not as much of an issue in kids, especially in the adult population with those with either a current any sort of cardiac problem or a family history, we have to be particularly cautious.
Hypertension, et cetera.
Yep. And then we also, we tend to treat a lot of patients with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and excessive dopamine produced by these medications, we know can cause very serious, catastrophic
sometimes
results.
A manic episode, or even be part of maybe causing a psychotic episode. So yeah, those are really important. One other question I have for you is, have you seen a tolerance that can sometimes develop in people over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, a lot of times that tolerance of sorts seems to develop very rapidly at those lower doses. And as we increase the doses, it does seem to slow down somewhat. But for people that have been on these medications, sometimes it doesn't even take more than a year, right, to get them up to max dose. And so as a result of that, I've kind of substantially changed the way in which I prescribe these medications over time to help to mitigate that tolerance effect. And so I've found a lot of those mitigating strategies to be quite successful in being able to keep people on those lower doses while still simultaneously being effective.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you start wondering if someone's like on a max dose of medication, ADHD medication for like 20 years, how much is that really, benefiting at that point? Of course, when you take it away, then yes, it's really going to cause an issue. But is it really helping beyond what they would have been at baseline without? So these are sometimes questions, I think, all the more reason why we need to look at this very holistically and realize, to get best outcomes for people's lives, we really need to use a holistic approach. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive into some ways to actually address ADHD beyond medication.
Sure. So just for you guys listening, this is definitely not a comprehensive approach of all of the holistic strategies or products that exist on the market today. If you're on, any sort of social media site and you've looked up ADHD in Google, and so it's started tracking you in your history, you're going to start getting advertisements for all sorts of different products that exist out there. And so some of those we will also cover in future episodes, but today we wanted to focus more on like apps and technology and whatnot. And so the first type of or suite of apps is the task and information organization type apps. So this would include things like calendars and to-do lists. So Dr. Binus, why might those types of apps be useful for people with ADHD?
Well, a core element of ADHD is that disorganization. And so figuring out how can I get organized can be very challenging because that executive function deficit. And so having an app or some sort of organizational strategy that really makes it as simple as possible can go a long ways to helping to stay on track, and rather than kind of going this way or that way.
And a physical calendar, right, or a whiteboard or something like that, often is better, especially if technology, say it's on your phone or your computer, that tends to be very distracting for you. But part of the problem with those is it's often difficult to carry those around with you, right? And so, especially if you tend to be fairly forgetful, it's nice to have something that's in the app form, that's with you wherever you go, that you can easily access it so that you're not forgetting those important things that you otherwise need to remember.
Otherwise, you're going to end up carrying more and more bags around with you everywhere you go, right? And I've seen some of these patients where it's like they'll come in with like 3 different bags. I'm like, okay, are we shopping here? But, not to make fun of them, but it's just like it starts to be a little much, and having all these calendars, et cetera, even though it can be helpful, can get confusing in and of itself. And so sometimes technology can help to hone those strategies a little better.
Yeah, my preferred app at the time, and unfortunately, I don't think it's there's a little bit of a waiting list to get on it, but it's called Routine, and it's a very useful calendar plus to-do task manager all into one, and it synchronizes across my devices. It makes it very easy. One of the problems that I've always had with many of these apps is they're not super fluid. Whenever I have the thought of something I need to do later, getting it into whatever it is that I'm, the app that I'm using at the time, right? So if there's a lot of resistance to me putting in that task that I want to do, then oftentimes I'll just say, I'll just try to remember it this time, right? And so I want it to be as easy as possible to put it into my my app, right? So that it's there for when I need it.
And is Routine easy to put in, or not?
It's very easy to put in. All it takes is me opening up my phone or on my computer. There's actually just a shortcut that basically I click a couple of buttons and it pops up. It sort of supersedes everything on my Mac, and then I can easily just type it in. And what's another nice thing about this particular app is it uses natural language processing, which essentially means that you can type in, do such and such a task on this particular day, or in 2 weeks, or remind me every month for the next year, right? You can say those types of phrases and it'll do that. So you don't have to be inundated with trying to remember these other things when you don't need them to be there, right? So
like,
you can
like pay my credit card every
right,
month
exactly.
or something like that.
So if that's not something you need to think about 30 or 29 days out of the month, then you really only want to see it on one day out of the month. And so, we can utilize technology to these means, so we can get rid of a lot of the unnecessary things that we need to remember, because it's going to be very efficient for that.
Yeah, and that frees up our brains to think about the task at hand rather than thinking about all the million things that we have to do in the next few days or whatever.
So there's a few other ways that you can go about it. Many people that have Android, you can use Google Calendar plus Google Tasks, right? That would be able to do it. Or Apple Calendar plus Apple Reminders. That could also be, a sufficient system. Or like I mentioned before, having a paper journal plus like a physical calendar / a whiteboard calendar. Those are all perfectly reasonable. I just like Routine because it combines them into one, and it's very sort of aesthetic looking.
So that's really helpful for information as far as like organizing, et cetera. What about remembering things?
Yeah, so there's this concept called the building a second brain, and it's a concept that had I known about it in college, or I should just say throughout my academic career, I think it would have really changed my life in very positive ways. Because there's so much that we do, there's so much information, especially in this age, living in the information age that we're exposed to, that we actually would like to have access to. And if you're not repeatedly exposed to that information and you're not intentional about doing so, then you're just going to forget it.
Exactly.
Right? And so this concept of building a second brain was using apps, using technology as a means of easily storing and organizing that information so that in the future, if you needed to access it, you could. Right. And so it's at this point, there are many individuals out there that have 10 to 15 years worth of data, right, that is kind of stored, that is easily accessible to them at any point in the future when they need to access it. And so it makes there are very specific use cases in which that can be really, really nice.
And
right?
that helped me remember Spanish better. I'm struggling with that.
Probably. But my personal app of choice is an app called Notion, and this app is think of it as like the folders app, or I should say the folders of your MacBook or your Windows, but just like on steroids. It's your ability to organize, your ability to add files, your ability to create tables, your ability to create links of information between multiple. So like, for example, they have a feature where, say you're writing up a document that incorporates the topic of ADHD. You can actually create a hyperlink with the topic of ADHD that will then link to all the other pages that you have in your database about that particular topic, right? And so the brain, that's how it builds its memories, is by creating links between the different pieces of information that you have. And so in a second way, or I should say in a way, like this is really taking that idea of that second brain to another level, because you can start creating links of information in the app itself. So it's a really, really cool app that is just continuing to get developed and just has so many different use cases.
Oh, that's really neat. And I've always thought I could use a second brain. So thank you, Jonathan.
Absolutely. A lot of people do use Evernote as well. That's been around for a really long time. I don't find it quite as streamlined or quite as comprehensive as Notion, but either of those are perfectly reasonable.
And what about for planning?
So when we talk about like family planning, this would be things like chores, groceries.
So we're not talking about number of kids here.
That's a good point. No, we're not talking about that. However, that is an important thing to definitely consider. But
I'm sure there's an app out there for it.
So I've had many women, especially, women that are stay-at-home moms, for example, with ADHD, and they just have such a hard time with a lot of the organization of the chores, right? And so there's a number of apps out there, like Cozy, for example, is a family planning app where you can create calendars and you can synchronize it with the other members of the family. So say you have kids and you've added chores to their list, right? If your kids, say, have the app as well, right? If they're, say, in high school and they've got phones already, then they'll get a notification saying, hey, mom wants you to do this particular chore. And then the parent can kind of check in and make sure that it's been done. So it easily makes sort of assigning things in the family or I should just say a simpler process. In addition, you can also store like recipes in there. You can have the family calendar for, say, like sports games or sports practice, just so you and your partner are on the same page, right? So all the sort of various tasks that you might think in a family, this is an app that could be definitely useful for that.
And will the app recommend disciplinary actions for the kids when they don't complete the chores?
I found another one. It's not Cozy specifically, but it does do something along those lines where you have chores and then you are assigned a certain number of points based on whether you do the chore, and negative points if you don't. And then after you've achieved so many points, then the parent will assign like a reward associated with those points.
Wow.
Right? So you might think taking out the trash is 25 points, and you need 100 to get an hour of video game time or something like that, right? And if you don't do it, then you're docked points. And so it's sort of a gamified way, if you will, of trying to keep things fair, keep things relatively organized, and to incentivize kids with this reward system for doing certain things. So I'm sorry I don't remember the app, but it is out there. If you look hard enough, you'll be able to find it. A couple others to consider. Remember the Milk is essentially just a grocery list organizer. I think you can store meal plans and stuff in there. And Sweepy is one that was actually recommended to me by a patient that she had ADHD, and she was having a really difficult time organizing how she should go about doing the chores in the household. And so these apps, many of these apps can actually, they'll sort of be a routine of sorts with different tasks that you have to do throughout the month, so to speak, right? And so maybe every 2 weeks it'll remind you, hey, you need to clean the bathroom, right? Every week it reminds you that you need to clean out the kitty litter box, right? Or you need to dust the windowsills or something like that, right? So that's another way to kind of get rid of all the stuff you have to think about, and then it only comes to you when you actually need to get it done.
All right. So any other areas of apps? And I suppose habits would be another area, right?
Yeah. Habit tracking apps, there's a myriad of them. So I don't really specifically have like a recommendation, but especially if there are some very identifiable habits that are going to be life-changing to you, that if you can stick with it over the long term is going to really propel you in your life in a meaningful way. So a simple one might be reading 30 minutes a day, something that's not a nonfiction book, right? Maybe a self-help book or a business-related book or something. If that is going to really move the needle in your life, then having a habit tracker can be a really motivational way, right? Because you don't want to lose your streak often, but it can also just be a really good reminder, because many of these apps will remind you on the daily, like, hey, have you done this thing today? Right. And some of them also have this social component. So you and your friends can kind of all see like how well you're doing, on your habits. And so these can definitely be, really good motivating and organization tools.
Thank you. And, one of the biggest challenges that a lot of people with ADD have, especially when it's related to students, is studying, right?
Yep.
So talk a little bit about things that people can do to improve their ability to focus when it comes to academics.
So a few apps that I've used, when I was going through school, when you're studying, especially a really challenging topic, it's amazing to me the other things that you all of a sudden find interesting. And so, a little self-disclosure, when I was in PA school and I was prepping for maybe my OBGYN exam, all of a sudden used cars looked really appealing to me. And so I'd spend too much time just looking at used cars. So using, whether you have ADHD or not, like a lot of times, especially if it's a really hard task that say requires you to be on a computer, and there's so many things that you could get distracted by, using some of these apps can be really useful. So Forest is an iPhone and Android app, I believe. And what's kind of unique and sort of playful about this app is that you grow a you grow a plant based on the time that you don't touch your phone. Right. And so as soon as you swipe away from the app, it'll say your plant is going to die. Right. You must go back to the app right away. And for a lot of people, it's that in and of itself is like, you don't want to kill your plant. Right. Even though it's, digital and we all know it's not real. But it can still be sort of motivating,
just a motivating factor, right?
To avoid using your device and getting distracted by it. Freedom is an app that you can use as a web browser extension. So you can go in there and you can sort of set timers for use of particularly distracting apps, or you can just block certain websites altogether, right? Self-control is the one that I used, and this one was very effective because you'd you'd plug in there all the websites and apps that you wanted to be blocked, and there was no way to stop it once you had started the timer. So say I started the timer for 8 hours, right? Because I wanted to be studying for that amount of time. Even if I deleted the app from my MacBook, all of the things that I initially set were still present, right? And so I use that often prior to, or I should say the day before an exam, because I didn't want to waste any time, with these distracting websites and stuff. And then the Pomodoro technique. There's a lot of timers out there that you can use, but the Pomodoro technique is essentially where you basically schedule study times with short breaks. So often you'll see like 30 minutes on, 10 minutes off, right? So you study for 30 minutes, you set a timer for 30 minutes. Once that goes off, you stop studying and you take a 10-minute break, right? Or maybe you're doing kind of a longer bout, right? So maybe you've done a couple sections of that, and then after you've done that a few times, maybe you'll take a longer 30-minute or an hour break. Right. So those can definitely be useful for going in short bursts, and then also taking the necessary rest and recuperation.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful when it comes to studying, to realize that our brain does need those breaks to actually function optimally. Now, we've covered a lot of different apps, and of course, one question that comes up for me is like we were talking about how media can be a distraction. Of course, you've mentioned how some of these apps can actually help to just keep from distracted from media. But, if I have ADHD and I'm thinking about now there's, 20 plus, I'm sure there's tons of different apps to help. I could get distracted with trying like all these. How do you actually even start with any of this?
That's a great question. And, hopefully, the way in which we're discussing about, or I should say the breakdown that we're discussing these in will help you kind of think about which one's going to be most relevant for you, right? If you're not a parent, if you're just say a college student, probably having the whole home sort of organizer or the family planning one, that's not going to be particularly useful for you, right? But you may definitely want to use, say, Notion plus maybe a calendar plus a to-do list app or something like that, right? And it's always best to start with one and see how that and see how that can incorporate into your life and really get comfortable with using that product. And over time, if it's not really serving you, but you're giving it a fair shot, then there's no downside to just dumping it and say moving on. But a quick Google search of best apps for productivity or organization or studying, right? There's going to be a lot of examples that'll come up.
So kind of looking at the biggest pain point and then maybe addressing that first and going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Another type of technology that I think is really fascinating is called binaural beats. So binaural beats, and I'll spell that for you real quick, just because not a lot of people know how it's spelled, but that's BINAURAL. So binaural beats are basically they're actually an auditory illusion that occurs when two different tones at slightly different frequencies are played into each ear. So essentially, it creates the sound of like a sine wave or a frequency. Right. And the idea there is it's supposed to not only both stimulate, but also synchronize with the frequencies of electrical activity that the brain puts out. And so there are different levels of, brain waves that are produced during different sort of states of consciousness. And so if you're really sort of activated and anxious, your brain waves are going to be at a different frequency. If you're really sleepy and sedated, they're going to be at a completely different frequency. And so they found that there's a particular frequency that's most useful for those that are trying to stay focused, and that's about 40 hertz. So there's a lot of apps out there that might focus on being used for focus, for studying, others that are used for more creative thinking, others that are used more for getting you prepped for sleep or relaxation, and it's also been studied in how it affects dopamine, and we've seen that it can increase the striatal levels of dopamine, which, as sort of implied, helps improve motivation and focus. I found that in my personal use of binaural beats, it really helps me get in sort of that flow state much quicker than when I don't use it. And then I find that I'm far less distracted in that state when I have it going. So it helps me sustain that degree of focus for longer durations.
Would some of our listeners might be concerned, like, is this kind of like a hypnotic sort of beats? But from what I'm hearing, it's actually the opposite. That instead of kind of making you zone out more, it's actually making you zone in more.
Absolutely.
And able to focus better.
Yeah, and it's not the most pleasing thing to listen to, right? It's sort of a humming sound. Now there are programs out there, apps out there, songs or YouTube videos, right? That where they basically take the binaural beat and they superimpose it with more melodic type sort of elevator music, if you will. And so that can also be helpful, especially if you find the beat itself to be somewhat jarring. But those have been shown to not be as effective. And so, if that's all you can really handle, then a lot of times what I do is I'll put maybe like some rain noise or something actually over the binaural beat, and that makes it a little bit more of a less sort of obnoxious sound. But you definitely don't want the sound to be too loud. Like, it shouldn't be giving you a headache. But at sort of a mid-level intensity, that often is what works really well for a lot of people.
Anything else on study tips?
Yeah, another thing is using flashcards. Now, I know a lot of people have kind of complaints about flashcards, and I do too. But in my opinion, one of the most useful tools that one can use to assimilate information in a very efficient way is what's called spaced repetition. And so spaced repetition is where you are exposed to information at increasing intervals over time. So let's just say there's a concept that you learn in class, and you really need to know that concept, but you also want it to be ingrained into your long-term memory. So you learn it the day of class, you write it down on a flashcard, and then the app that I used in school was Anki. And so Anki basically has the spaced repetition baked in. And so you'll see it the first day, you'll study it, and you'll keep studying it until you get it right? And then you'll see it the next day. And if you miss it, then you see it again the day later. If you get it right, then you see it like 3 to 5 days later, right? And then if you get it right again, then you see it maybe a week or 2 weeks later, right? And so it just gets longer and longer and longer. And so this is really the most efficient way for you to learn a particular concept. And so, I found this incredibly effective in many of my classes in school. And there's a couple others like Brainscape and Quizlet. These are other really good flashcard apps. But personally, at least for medicine, for language learning, I think Anki is definitely the best option.
So another area of intervention that's holistic is supplements. We're not going to spend any real time talking about that in this episode. We will dive into that in more detail in subsequent episodes. And just to let our viewers know as a teaser, there is a lot that can be done actually with supplements, and it's pretty exciting. So let's talk about a few other techniques that are holistic, different than medications to address ADHD.
So the first one that I think is worthy of mentioning, particularly for those that tend to forget very important items.
Lose a lot of things.
Yeah, so keys, I think wallets, right? These types of
what
things.
About phones?
Phones, luckily most phones have GPS, so as long as you have somebody else around you that you can access maybe your Apple ID or whatnot, then you should be able to find it. But things like keys in particular and wallets, those tend to be the most, I should say, problematic if you lose for a lot of my, especially for a lot of my individuals with ADHD, because it tends to happen more often than sort of the average individual.
I lost my wallet again. I've heard that several times, yes.
So my favorite way to manage this is to use either like the Apple AirTag. If you're not in the Apple ecosystem, then a Tile is another really good product. And these are basically just GPS chips that you can attach to various devices. Some people even use them to attach to, say, their cats, or their dogs, right?
Or their children, maybe.
Or their children, maybe. I don't know. Probably. I do have a patient. He has slipped it into his father's coat pocket because his father has dementia, and so he's often leaving the house, wandering miles away, makes him difficult to find. So since I recommended a couple months ago, I recommended that he do this. Every time his father has left, he's been able to find him. So. Those are some great options. Kind of switching gears, we did want to talk about maybe a little bit more of a unique thing to consider. And this takes a little bit of explanation, but I do want to give credit where credit's due. I originally heard about this on the Andrew Huberman podcast, and he's actually a neuroscientist at Stanford. So he introduced me to this idea during one of his ADHD episodes. And so the idea is, or I should say, it's a discussion on blinking and how blinking affects the perception of time as well as dopamine. And when used appropriately, modulating your blinking to a particular degree can increase dopamine and therefore increase focus. So one thing that one analogy he sort of uses whenever you blink, it's kind of like the setting of a scene, right? Whenever you say sort of action, right, or you close the curtain. And by doing that, you're sort of resetting the brain's interpretation of time, and so the degree or the rapidness at which you blink is going to make your perception of how long, right, the time interval is sort of change. So, for example, like when you're in a heightened state of stress, the thought. Like when you go to, say, a new doctor, right? Often people, when they come to see us for the first time, right, they're sort of anxiously waiting in the waiting room, and 5 minutes can feel like a really long time, right? As you're waiting for the provider to come out.
They've been blinking a lot.
Then they've been blinking a lot, right? So during that time, right, time seems to go really slowly. And we also know that when dopamine is really high, right, time is perceived to slow down. And when dopamine is really low, time is perceived to speed up. So one strategy, in addition to just like having a particular focal point, so let's just say you're trying to sit down, you're trying to study for something that's going to be time intensive. For the first like 30 seconds to a minute, if you just focus on something, about arm's length away, maybe half arm's length away, somewhere in there for that time frame, and then you kind of force yourself to blink a little bit more rapidly, that can increase your dopamine levels and increase your capacity to focus.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I remember in my residency training, one of my mentors pointed out that a lot of people with psychosis, when they're in an acute psychotic episode, they will actually blink more rapidly, more frequently. And so we do see that association with dopamine and blinking, because that's one of the underlying issues with someone being in a psychotic episode, is that they have too much dopamine being released in certain parts of the brain. So that connection with blinking and dopamine makes a lot of sense.
And then the last one we wanted to talk about was just mindfulness-based practices. And so, Dr. Binus, why don't you cover this one?
Yeah, so basically, one of the challenges with focus is actually either getting into our head too much and thinking about way too many things, or just like being distracted by this, and this. And so when we talk about mindfulness, it's actually slowing it down. It's bringing it to the present moment, and also even in the present moment, focusing on one particular thing at a time. And, a simple example of this might be if we're taking a walk, like, okay, well, instead of just like me looking all around and looking at this and that and allowing my thoughts to drift here or there, and it's like, oh, yeah, your mind's going to be all over the place. Just being present in the moment, looking at one thing at a time. Oh, look at that bird over there. What color is the bird? Let me listen to the way the bird is singing. Oh, look over there. There's a flower. So you're really being present in the moment. You're noticing things. So the more people practice that mindfulness, being present in the moment, the more it allows our attention. We're essentially practicing paying attention. Mm-hmm. And anything that we practice, we get better at. And I think that's a really wonderful way that God's created, our brains, that the more we repeat something, the more we practice at something, even if we're not good at paying attention, we can actually get better at it over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else you want to add to that, Jonathan?
I think that was sufficient for today.
All right. Well, thank you to our viewers. I hope this is very informative. Don't get too overwhelmed by all the options with the apps. Like Jonathan said, really start with those areas that are going to be the most effective, where you're lacking the most, and then, go from there. But just start with one app and see how it works for you. If it doesn't work, you can try something else. And don't forget, we're going to have subsequent episodes on holistic management of ADHD. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.